The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, not at night, not during a storm, just an ordinary day, the kind that makes bad news feel unreal. The envelope was thin, official, heavy in a way paper shouldn't be. Inside, only a few sentences. We regret to inform you that your son was killed in action. No details, no body, no goodbye. Across the United States, tens of thousands of families opened letters like this during World War II. Mothers collapsed into kitchen chairs. Fathers stared at walls for hours without speaking. Wives folded uniforms that would never be worn again, or so they were told, because for some of these families, the truth was far stranger. Their sons were not dead, they were alive, but officially they no longer existed. In World War II, chaos moved faster than truth. Entire units vanished in forests, islands, and frozen fields. Battles ended with smoke still hanging in the air, bodies unrecognizable, dog tags missing, paperwork incomplete. And when a soldier didn't report back, the military had to decide, missing or dead. Pressure mattered. Morale mattered. Records had to be closed. So sometimes, after weeks or even days, a man was declared dead without confirmation. A name typed, a file stamped, a life erased on paper. But war doesn't follow paperwork. In prisoner camps, underground tunnels, jungle villages, and improvised hospitals, soldiers who had been declared dead were still breathing, unaware that back home, their funerals had already happened. One infantryman woke up in a German POW camp in 1944 with a shattered leg and no memory of the explosion that put him there. Months later, a Red Cross list reached him. His own name was on the dead roster. He stared at it for a long time. Dead men didn't feel pain. Dead men didn't wake up screaming. Dead men didn't wonder if their mothers had stopped waiting. On the American home front, grief settled into routine. Empty chairs at dinner tables, gold stars in windows, photographs slowly fading in frames. Then, sometimes, a knock, not from a ghost, from a man thinner than memory, standing on the porch, holding papers that said he was no one. Because once a soldier was declared dead, undoing it was not simple. Military systems weren't designed for resurrection. Some returning soldiers were treated with suspicion. Others were lost in bureaucracy. Pay stopped. Benefits vanished. In some cases, identities had been reassigned or archived so deeply that proving you were alive became harder than surviving the war itself. One man tried to re-enlist and was told his record showed he had died 2 years earlier in Italy. Another was denied veterans' benefits because, according to official files, he had never come home. Imagine surviving combat, only to be told you don't exist. These men carried 2 wars inside them, the one they fought overseas, and the one they fought against silence when they returned. They learned that death was final, but being erased was worse. Some stayed quiet, changed names, started over. Others spent decades writing letters, filing appeals, trying to correct a single line in a dusty archive. Many never succeeded. Their families knew the truth. The government did not. And there were darker cases. Special operations units, classified missions, men dropped behind enemy lines with instructions that included a chilling sentence: if captured or killed, your existence will be denied. For these soldiers, being declared dead wasn't a mistake, it was policy. Some returned under strict orders never to speak, their medals classified, their stories locked away. They lived normal lives with abnormal silence. And every Memorial Day, they watched parades honoring the fallen, knowing their own names were carved on lists of the dead. By the war's end, thousands of soldiers had been misreported as killed. Some cases were corrected quickly, others were never corrected at all. Official death certificates remained active, while living men grew old beneath them. History moved on. Records stayed wrong. And somewhere in America, there are still families who believe their grandfather died overseas, unaware he came home under another name, carrying a truth no one asked him to prove. Because World War II didn't just kill men, it erased them. When the war ended, trains arrived before answers did. Stations filled with noise, whistles, shouting, crying, laughter that sounded almost painful after years of silence. Families pressed forward, scanning faces, searching for someone they had already buried in their minds. And sometimes they saw him, a man older than the photograph on the mantel, thinner, slower, but alive. At first, there was disbelief, then screaming, then arms around a body that felt real in a way grief never was. But joy didn't last long, because coming home was not the same as being welcomed back into existence. Many of these soldiers returned with papers stamped incorrectly or not at all. Their units had been dissolved, their commanding officers reassigned or killed, their service records frozen under a single word: deceased. One former paratrooper arrived in New York in late 1945 and went straight to the Veterans Administration to claim his discharge benefits. The clerk typed his name, paused, then looked up with confusion. "You can't be here," she said. His file said he had died in Normandy. Officially, he was a ghost trying to collect money. Fixing the mistake should have taken days. It took years. The military system was drowning in paperwork, millions of men moving in and out, records damaged by bombings, ships sunk with files aboard, offices destroyed overseas, and there was no priority for the living dead. Some soldiers were asked to produce witnesses, men who had fought beside them. But many of those witnesses were actually dead. Others had been reassigned across the world. Proof became impossible. One soldier was told the only way to correct his status was to locate the officer who had signed his death report. That officer had been killed months later in the same war. The system had no way to undo itself. For some men, the consequences were brutal. Pay arrears denied. Medical care delayed. Families left without survivor benefits because technically there was no survivor. Wives who had remarried after receiving death notices were now married to living men who legally did not exist. Children born after the war were listed under fathers who were officially dead. Life became a maze of contradictions. But the worst damage wasn't financial, it was psychological. These soldiers had survived combat by clinging to the idea of home, to the belief that someone knew they were alive, that someone was waiting to return and discover they had already been mourned, already replaced, already forgotten. That broke something deeper than shrapnel ever could. Some men stopped correcting people. When neighbors said, "I thought you were dead," they nodded. It felt easier. Others leaned into silence. No medals on the wall, no stories at dinner, no acknowledgement that they had been anywhere at all, especially those who had served in classified units. OSS operatives, covert reconnaissance teams, intelligence couriers dropped into enemy territory with fake names and no dog tags. If they were declared dead, that status stayed, because acknowledging their survival would expose missions that never officially happened. These men returned under orders that followed them home. Do not speak, do not write, do not remember publicly. Some were denied recognition even within the military. Their wounds were treated quietly, their trauma dismissed. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis yet, just weakness. So they learned to disappear in plain sight. They became mechanics, teachers, postal workers, accountants, men who flinched at loud noises, men who avoided fireworks, men who never explained why. History books celebrated battles and generals, but these men didn't fit into chapters. They were anomalies, errors, footnotes that never made it to print. And then there were the funerals. Some soldiers attended their own, quietly, standing at the back of cemeteries as priests read their names aloud, watching families cry over empty coffins filled with uniforms and sand. One man later said it felt like watching his life from outside his body. He wanted to scream, "I'm here," but he didn't, because he had been told his existence no longer served a purpose. By the 1950s, America was moving forward. Suburbs grew, television glowed, the war became memory. And these men carried a strange truth into old age. They had survived something no one would ever fully believe. Some tried again, decades later, to correct the record. Letters to archives, appeals to military boards, requests for amended death certificates. Many were denied. Too much time had passed. Files were lost. Witnesses gone. The war had closed its doors. By the time anyone tried to count them, it was already too late. The war was over. The archives were closed. The urgency that once drove everything, orders, casualties, lives, had faded into filing cabinets and dust. And the men who had come back from the dead were aging. Some carried folded letters in their pockets until the paper turned soft. Others kept the official death notices in drawers, not as proof, but as a reminder of how easily a life could be erased, because, in the end, many never got their names back. Military review boards existed, but they demanded certainty, dates, locations, witnesses. War provided none of those. A man who had spent months hiding in the Ardennes forest after his unit was overrun was asked to prove where he had been during that time. He couldn't, no one could. And so the record stayed unchanged. In official history, he died in December 1944. In reality, he raised 3 children, worked 40 years in a factory, and was buried under a name that technically never came home. This is the part of World War II we rarely talk about. We imagine the war as something that ends cleanly, treaties signed, flags raised, soldiers returning in neat lines. But for some, the war never ended, because their death had already been processed. Some families never learned the truth. Parents died believing their sons were buried overseas. Wives remarried and took secrets with them. Children grew up with photographs of fathers who had actually been alive somewhere else in the same country. In rare cases, the truth surfaced accidentally. A census form, a hospital record, a pension inquiry that didn't match. And suddenly, decades later, a file was reopened. One man in the 1970s finally received a corrected status letter nearly 30 years after the war. It read simply, "Previous report of death, erroneous. No apology, no explanation, just a correction." But by then, the world had moved on without him. There was no parade, no ceremony, no moment where history paused to let him step back in. The war memorial in his hometown still listed his name among the dead. He didn't ask for it to be removed. "It's the only proof I was ever there," he said. And then there were the ones we still don't know about, because not every file was a mistake. Some disappearances were deliberate, covert missions erased from records, units whose names never existed, soldiers whose survival created risks the government didn't want to acknowledge. For them, being declared dead was permanent. They lived full lives under partial identities. They watched documentaries about the war they fought in and never saw themselves. Their grandchildren would grow up loving history without knowing their own blood had been written out of it. This is what erasure really looks like. Not flames, not explosions, just silence. World War II reshaped the world, but it also revealed something quieter, more unsettling. That history is not only written by the victors, it is written by the surviving paperwork. And when the paperwork is wrong, truth struggles to breathe. Some of these men are still listed as killed in action today. Names carved in stone, records locked in archives, stories unfinished. They lived after death. They died again in history. And somewhere, in a forgotten drawer or an unmarked file, there is still a version of the past that hasn't been corrected because no one is left to ask for it. This was the war beyond the battlefield, the war against being forgotten.